Hello biology class. Today we're looking at section 3 of chapter 18, which is on the actual process of speciation. Let's begin. How is it that one species diverges into two distinct species that no longer can interbreed with each other? We're going to be investigating that today. Admittedly, this will be a pretty simplified version of this. This topic would take many class periods to cover thoroughly, but our goal is basically just to introduce it here. So, islands are some of the best places that we can observe the effects of evolution. Many island species are found nowhere else on the planet. Now, why is that? Well, we'll get into that. Sometimes the species we see on islands are subspecies, such as Sumatran rhinos, Sumatran tigers, or Pinta Island tortoises. What I mean by subspecies is a Sumatran tiger and a Bengal tiger could breed with each other. So they're different because they're isolated, but they're still part of a same species. That's why we say a subspecies. But many species that live on islands are totally unique, and they only exist on these small isolated islands. So this would be cassowaries, kiwis, Tasmanian devils, lemurs, we're called tarsiers, and dodo birds. Pour one out for our dead homies. So here are just some examples. If you didn't know that a kiwi was also a bird, it's the one on the top left over here. The Sumatran rhino is right there in the middle, the Sumatran tiger, top right. Cassowaries, they only live in Papua New Guinea, which is like just north of Australia. Kiwis, I forgot to say, they live only in New Zealand. Tarsiers live in a couple of different Pacific islands, such as, I think they live in the Philippines, possibly Borneo as well. And then Komodo dragons, which live on the islands of Komodo, and that's it. Something really interesting that happens with islands was there's two things. There's what's called island dwarfism, or insular dwarfism, and island gigantism, or insular gigantism. Komodo dragons are by far the largest lizards on the planet, and it's not even close. But they live on a really small island. And then you take the Sumatran rhino, and there used to be elephants that lived on islands that were really small. A lot of times they were called pygmy rhinos or pygmy elephants or whatever. So for whatever reason, animals that on a main continent are extremely large, when they go and live on islands, they become very small. And many other species that are normally really small, such as birds, most birds are really tiny, but when they, and then lizards too, when they get dumped on islands, the opposite happens. They become gigantic. I have a really cool video by a dude named Trey the Explainer. We watched one of his videos before, and I'm going to put it on Google Classroom. It's on evolution on islands. Watch it. Next week, I'm going to make an assignment for it. Just a heads up. Okay, so why? Now, being on an island isolates you. That's why it's such a good place to see the effects of evolution. But why is isolation a driving force for speciation? Well, we'll go back to what we talked about in the last video. Try to remember, and I'll pull them up here, the graphs from the last time about population size. So the allele frequency was way more unstable. The graph of the allele frequency went up and down like crazy when you had a small population. When there was a really large population, the allele frequency, it wobbled a bit, but it was very stable. Now, isolation always begins with you have your overall population, and then just a couple members are going to leave. So we call that like a subpopulation. And they'll interbreed separately from the original population, and so a smaller population has much more variation in the allele frequency. So here's that graph from last time. On the top, we have a population of 10,000 individuals. On the bottom, everything about them is exactly the same. The environmental pressures and whatnot, all the variables. The only difference is the population is 1/10 the size, and you can see there's way more variation over the generations. That's going to produce speciation. Okay, let's look at this in a different way for you visual learners. Let's say we have a gene and there are two alleles for it, A and B. A is blue, the phenotype for the A gene, the A allele is blue, the phenotype for the B allele is red, and together they make purple. So let's say in Africa, the population's like, it's very large and there's an even mixture. So when you evenly mix red and blue, you get purple. Now let's say out of Africa, two small groups of individuals, they just leave. One goes into Asia, one migrates up towards like Europe. Well, because they're small and isolated, and because Asia, Europe, and Africa are all very different from each other, the selective pressures, the environments, what works here versus what works there is going to be different in every case. And we see in the Asia population, the B allele, that just simply fits the environment better. So gradually they start to differentiate and they become red, and the other population becomes blue. They're still carrying with them the original genes, however, the original alleles, however, the ratio changes as they go into these different environments. Isolation doesn't just have to be physical, it can be behavioral. Two species that once belonged to the same species can diverge through behavioral changes. So many similar organisms, they actually have overlapping habitats, but they don't interbreed because of behavioral differences. It might be the way they court for mates, like they have a specific call or dance or whatever that's unique from the other one. It might be because they live in a different habitat, like one only lives in the trees and the other lives on the ground or whatever. Now, the weird thing about this is some of these species, they could interbreed. Like in a lab, we could force them to or whatever. It's just that in nature, they never ever do, simply because of behavior. They just never, although they live in the same area, they don't ever hang out in the exact same places. So maybe there's somebody at school that you know and you're not friends with them. Why? Well, because they're on the volleyball team and you are on the basketball team, and so you just never hang out. An example your book talks about is the western and eastern meadowlark. They look extremely similar and they have an overlapping territory between them, but they won't breed with each other. And western meadowlarks have one of the most interesting calls of any bird. Go on YouTube and listen to western meadowlark calls. It's really cool. I can't remember what the specific species is. I looked through one of my books to see if I could find it, but I couldn't. So let me see if I can explain this. I do know that there are types of migratory birds. Now, birds can spread all over the planet, and this one particular species of bird, it has many subspecies. They're actually found all around the planet. So one of them, its territory is like what's shaded in red here, right? And then as you move further to the east, it transitions and there's a slightly different subspecies of the same bird, and so I colored that one yellow. And then slightly or more to the east of that, there's the green one, the blue one, so on and so on. Now what's really cool about this is, let's just start from the far left. The bluebirds can breed with the purple birds. They're very slightly different, but technically they're part of the same subspecies and they can breed with each other. So the blue and the purple can breed. The purple and the pink birds can breed with each other. The pink and the red birds can breed with each other. The red and the yellow birds can breed with each other. You get the idea. However, the green birds and the blue birds, way over here, they can't interbreed with each other. Now that's really interesting. This one and this one, it's fine. This one and this one, it's fine. This one and this one, it's fine. But so they can interbreed all the way down the line. However, if you take the opposite ends of that line, or that, in this case, we're talking about like where they live, they can't interbreed. So it's a really cool demonstration of how this separation causes the speciation. Because if they can't interbreed, they're not part of the same species. So that takes us into geographic isolation, which is what I started off with islands. And this is the most rapid speciation process. When you physically separate animals, or this happens with plants too, but when you physically separate them, then they really start to differentiate. And there are several ways that geographic isolation can happen. To some animals, a river or a mountain is like a permanent barrier. They just simply can't get over it. Now, for a bird, a river or a mountain probably isn't much of a barrier. But for like an insect, it definitely might be. And for a mammal, it definitely might be. For birds, maybe they have to get stuck on an island. There are all kinds of flightless birds that got stuck on their own island. New Zealand, and Australia is not an island, but it's kind of like an island. But Australia and Papua New Guinea and a few others. And geographic isolation really just happens accidentally. The way a species gets to an island and then gets stuck there, that's really not under the control of the animal. So here's a cool example. These are two different species of leopard. The top one is the Amur leopard, and they only live in the region highlighted in red. The bottom is the snow leopard, and they only live in the region highlighted in blue here. Now, if we compare that, this is just sort of a blank map that I grabbed. If we compare that to what's called a topographical map here on the bottom right, we can see that the snow leopards, their territory overlaps very nicely with the brown region there. What is that? Well, that shows elevation. The brown are really, really high, either mountaintops or plateaus. That is a barrier that the snow leopards are sort of stuck in. So that's their habitat range. For the Amur leopard, it's a little harder to see, but like on the peninsula of Korea, there are some mountains around it, and so they can't really get beyond that. And other species of leopards can't get through it either. Temporal isolation, this is when species, they breed at different times. So again, the definition of a species is it's a group of organisms that breed with each other and have fertile offspring. So this is actually, it sounds really simple, but it's actually a pretty significant factor. It's similar to behavioral isolation, but when an organism breeds is not considered a behavior. The way they might like attract mates, the type of call they have, the type of coloring they have, that's considered behavioral, but not when they choose to breed. A really interesting example of this is cicadas. Cicadas so most insects undergo metamorphism. They start off as a larva, and then as an adult, they look wildly different. Cicadas stay underground for either 13 or 17 years, and then they come out and then they develop wings and they die shortly after. Now, why 13 and 17 years? Well, that means that they only ever emerge at the same time once every 221 years, because 221 is the least common multiple of 13 and 17. This drastically increases their survival potential because they rarely pop out of the ground at the same time. When they do pop out of the ground, they have to quickly eat as much food as they can and then breed with each other as fast as they can to lay eggs and then start their life cycle over. By merging every 13 or 17 years and only ever overlapping every 221 years, it makes the odds really good that they're not going to have nearly as much competition for resources. So we have cicadas in South Dakota. I don't know if they really exist here, but you rarely ever see them. You only ever see their shell. They leave their exoskeleton behind. That's what they look like as a larva. And then the adult hatches out of that and it's got wings. They fly around, they breed, and then they die. But these regions on the map, I grabbed this off of the YouTube channel, It's Okay to Be Smart. That shows how there's tons and tons of overlap. However, because they're only popping out of the ground every 13 or 17 years or whatever, they don't have very much competition. To wrap up here, if you remember Trey the Explainer, who I brought up earlier, he's the guy we watched the video on the finches on Daphne Major. Those two biologists, Peter and Rosemary Grant, studied them. Now, that story, I actually didn't realize this, but that story is told on page 572 in your book, and then it's retold in this current section. I do want you to read it. I'm not going to go over all of the details here, but just really quick, it was a brilliant example of seeing speciation specifically through the process of directional selection. So if we look at this graph here real quick, I have the bell curve for each of them, and the bell curves are stacked right on top of each other. The original population is on the top. There was a drought, and so there was less food, and only birds with large, strong beaks could crack open enough seeds to get the food. So we can see that the average shifted forward. It favored an extreme or a different variety of the phenotype. So you can now see that the original bell curve, the average is towards one end of it. And that wraps up this lesson. Short and sweet. Make sure you get all your homework done, just 2 assignments for this week. And next week we'll continue with this chapter and go a little bit further with some other things. Take care.